The sound of 8 wives weeping in unison was what finally made Willa Zimmerman understand she would rather die in the desert than spend one more night in Ezekiel Preston's compound. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the barn, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, and watched the main house through a gap in the boards while the September moon hung fat and silver over the Arizona territory. It was 1881. And she had been promised as the 9th wife just 3 weeks ago when her father sold her for 60 head of cattle and a plot of irrigated land near Coolidge. The night air smelled of dust and horse sweat and the lingering smoke from the evening fires. Willa had waited until the household settled into sleep, until even the guards posted at the compound gates had grown drowsy with the lateness of the hour. She wore the plainest dress she owned, a faded brown cotton thing that would not catch moonlight, and she had braided her wheat-colored hair tight against her skull. At 20 years old, she had never made a decision entirely her own until this moment. She crept toward the corral where Preston kept his horses. Her plan was no plan at all, really just desperation dressed up as courage. She would take a horse and ride north toward Tucson, or maybe west toward Yuma. Anywhere but here. Anywhere she could disappear into the vastness of the territory and never hear Ezekiel Preston's voice again, never feel his cold hands on her shoulders, never sit at that long table with 8 other women whose eyes had gone dead with resignation. The corral gate creaked when she touched it. Willa froze, every muscle locked tight with fear. One of the horses snorted and shifted in the darkness. She waited, counting her heartbeats, but no shout of alarm came from the house or the bunkhouse where Preston's ranch hands slept. She was reaching for the gate latch when a voice spoke from the shadows, low and careful. "You are making enough noise to wake every coyote between here and Phoenix." Willa spun around, a scream catching in her throat. A man stepped out from behind the water trough, tall and lean in the moonlight, wearing a battered hat and dusty range clothes. She could not see his face clearly, but she could see the gun belt at his hip and the way he held his hands out from his sides, showing he meant no immediate harm. "Please," she whispered, "please do not tell them." The man tilted his head, studying her. "Tell who what?" "Mr. Preston, I am leaving. I know it is wrong. I know I was promised, but I cannot do it. I cannot be his wife. I will not." The cowboy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are the new one, the one who came 3 weeks ago." It was not a question, but Willa nodded anyway. She was shaking now, her whole body trembling with fear and adrenaline and the desperate wildness of what she was attempting. "Are you one of his men?" "I work for him," the cowboy said slowly, "but I am not his man. There is a difference." "Will you stop me?" Another pause. The night insects sang in the scrub brush beyond the corral. One of the horses woofed and stamped its feet. "Can you ride?" the cowboy asked. "Yes, my father had horses before he—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Before he sold me like a piece of livestock." The cowboy seemed to make up his mind about something. He moved past her to the corral gate and opened it with practiced ease, making almost no sound. "The bay mare," he said quietly, "third from the left. She has good wind and better sense than most people I know. She will not throw you even if you push her hard." Willa stared at him, unable to process what was happening. "You are helping me?" "I am giving you a choice, which is more than anyone else around here seems inclined to do." He walked into the corral, and the horses shifted and murmured, recognizing him. He approached the bay mare, and she came to him willingly. Within minutes, he had her saddled and bridled, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He led the mare out of the corral and handed Willa the reins. Up close, she could see his face better in the moonlight. He had strong features, weathered by sun and wind, and eyes that seemed kind despite the hardness that frontier life carved into everyone. He looked maybe 25 or 26, old enough to have seen things, but young enough that they had not broken him yet. You will want to ride west toward Gila Bend, he said. Stay off the main road. Follow the washes where the ground is harder, and you will not leave as much trail. When the sun comes up, find shade and rest. Travel by night for at least 3 days. Why are you doing this? Willa asked. Her eyes were burning with tears she refused to let fall. The cowboy looked back toward the main house, his jaw tight. Because I have 8 sisters back in Kansas, and I would hope if they were ever in a situation like this, some fool cowboy would help them out. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. There is about $40 here. It is not much, but it will get you started somewhere. Willa could not speak. She took the pouch with shaking hands. Now go, the cowboy said, and do not look back. I'll make sure no one follows you right away. I'll tell them in the morning that I saw someone steal the horse, that they rode south toward Florence. That will buy you time. What is your name? Willa asked. He smiled, just a little. Yates Ormond, though I expect you should forget it soon as you can. I will remember, Willa said fiercely. I will remember this for the rest of my life. Then make sure the rest of your life is a long one. Now ride. Willa pulled herself into the saddle, her skirts bunching awkwardly around her legs. The mare shifted beneath her, sensing her nervousness. But Yates was right. She was steady and calm. Willa gathered the reins, looked down at the cowboy one more time, and saw something in his face that made her heart twist in an entirely new way. Thank you, she said. You are welcome. Now go, before I lose my nerve, and my job both. Willa touched her heels to the mare's sides, and the horse moved forward, walking at first and then breaking into a smooth trot as they cleared the compound. Behind her, Yates Ormond closed the corral gate and melted back into the shadows. Willa pointed the mare west and let her stretch into a canter, and then finally into a ground-eating gallop that carried them away from the compound and into the vast darkness of the Arizona desert. She rode for hours, following Yates's advice about the washes and the hard ground. The moon tracked across the sky above her, and the desert stretched out in every direction, silver and black and infinite. She had never felt so terrified or so free in her entire life. Every shadow could be a pursuer, every sound could be the beginning of her recapture, but the mare ran steady and true beneath her, and the miles accumulated behind them. When the sky began to lighten in the east, Willa finally slowed the mare to a walk and began looking for shelter. She found a cluster of rocks and a twisted mesquite tree that cast enough shade to hide both her and the horse. She dismounted on shaking legs, her body aching from the hard ride. The mare was lathered with sweat but still alert, her ears swiveling to catch every sound. Willa used some of the water from the canteen Yates had thoughtfully attached to the saddle to give the mare a drink from her cupped hands. Then she drank sparingly herself, knowing water would be precious out here. She unsaddled the horse and used handfuls of dry grass to rub her down as best she could. When the mare was comfortable, Willa sat down with her back against one of the rocks and finally let herself shake apart. She cried quietly, her face buried in her hands, letting out all the fear and rage and desperate hope that had been building inside her for weeks. She cried for the life she had lost when her father made his bargain with Ezekiel Preston. She cried for her mother, dead these 5 years, who would have fought tooth and nail to prevent this marriage. She cried for the 8 women back at the compound who were still trapped in that terrible household. And she cried with relief because she was out. She was free, and she had a chance now, however slim, to make a life on her own terms. When the tears finally stopped, Willa wiped her face and looked out at the desert beginning to reveal itself in the growing light. She had no real plan beyond survival. She knew Gila Bend was west, and beyond that Yuma, and beyond that California. Perhaps she could find work as a cook or a seamstress or a laundress in one of the mining towns. Perhaps she could even make it all the way to California and reinvent herself completely. But first she had to survive the next 3 days without being caught. Willa curled up in the shade and tried to sleep. It came in fits and starts. her body exhausted, but her mind too wired with adrenaline to truly rest. She kept seeing Yates Ormond's face in the moonlight, kept hearing his voice telling her which horse to take, kept feeling the weight of his $40 in the leather pouch. He had saved her life tonight, no question about it. Without his help, she would have made too much noise or taken the wrong horse or not known which direction to run. She owed him everything, and she would probably never see him again. That thought made her chest ache in a strange way she did not want to examine too closely. The day crawled by, hot and bright. Willa dozed and woke and dozed again, always listening for the sound of pursuit. But the desert stayed quiet except for the wind and the occasional call of a bird. When the sun finally began its descent toward the western horizon, she saddled the mare again and set out. For 3 nights, she followed the pattern Yates had suggested. Ride through the night, rest during the day, stay off the roads, follow the washes. She rationed the water carefully, and when she found a small stream on the second night, she drank her fill and refilled the canteen. The mare grazed on desert grasses when they rested, and seemed to be holding up well despite the hard travel. On the morning of the 4th day, Willa reached a small settlement that was barely more than a cluster of buildings around a well. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a few scattered houses. She debated riding past it entirely, but she needed supplies and the mare needed proper grain, and she was so tired she could barely think straight. She rode in carefully, watching for any sign that someone might recognize her or the horse, but the few people out and about this early barely glanced at her. She dismounted in front of the general store, tied the mare to the hitching rail, and went inside. The store was dim and smelled of flour and coffee and pickle brine. An older woman stood behind the counter, her hair gray and her eyes sharp. "Help you?" she asked. "I need some supplies," Willa said. Her voice sounded hoarse from disuse. "Hardtack jerky, coffee if you have it, and grain for my horse." The woman studied her with those sharp eyes, taking in her dusty dress and wind-burned face and the desperate edge to her voice. "You are a long way from anywhere, miss." "I am heading to Yuma," Willa said, "to meet my brother." It was a lie, but a plausible one. The woman seemed to accept it. She gathered the supplies Willa requested and named a price. Willa paid from Yates's $40 and tried not to wince at how quickly the money was disappearing. As the woman was wrapping her purchases, the door opened and 2 men walked in. They wore dusty range clothes and had the hard-eyed look of men who did whatever job paid best, whether it was legal or not. Willa's heart jumped into her throat, and she forced herself to stay calm, to not react, to keep her face neutral. "Morning, May," one of the men said to the woman behind the counter. "We're looking for someone, a girl, about 20, fair hair. She stole a horse from a ranch up near Coolidge 4 nights back. You seen anyone like that?" May looked at Willa. For a long, terrible moment, Willa was certain she was caught. But then May said, "I have not seen anyone like that. Only regular traffic through here the last few days." The man grunted. "If you do see her, there is a $20 reward for information leading to her recovery. Mr. Preston is real eager to get his property back." His property. Willa felt bile rise in her throat, but she kept her face down, pretending to fuss with the wrapped packages on the counter. The men looked around the store, their eyes passing over Willa without much interest. She was dusty and dirty and unremarkable, just another frontier woman going about her business. Finally they left, the door banging shut behind them. May finished wrapping the last package in silence. Then she said quietly, "The trail west to Yuma is not always safe for a woman alone. You might want to consider heading north instead. Flagstaff is growing fast, and there is work for those willing to do it. Less likely to run into certain types up there, if you understand my meaning." Willa met her eyes. The older woman's face was expressionless, but there was something in her gaze that was almost kind. "Thank you," Willa said. "I will consider that." "You do that, dear. And be careful. The territory can be a hard place for a girl on her own." Willa gathered her supplies and walked out. The 2 men were standing near the saloon talking to someone else. She forced herself to walk calmly to the mare. to pack the supplies into the saddlebags without hurry, to mount up smoothly. Then she turned the horse north, toward the mountains in the distance, and rode out of the settlement at an easy pace that would not draw attention. Only when she was a mile out of town did she let the mare stretch into a gallop again, racing away from danger one more time. She followed May's advice and turned north toward Flagstaff. The terrain changed as she climbed in elevation, the harsh desert giving way to grassland, and then to pine forests that smelled sharp and green and reminded her achingly of her childhood in Colorado before her mother died and everything fell apart. She passed ranches and small farms, and one night she slept in a barn that belonged to a family who fed her dinner and asked no questions when she said she was traveling to Flagstaff to find work. It took her another week to reach the town, and by then Willa was exhausted to her bones. But she had made it. She had escaped Ezekiel Preston and traveled nearly 200 miles on her own, and she was still free. Flagstaff was bigger than she expected, a bustling lumber town with a railroad running through it. Willa sold the bay mare to a livery owner for a fair price, even though it hurt to let the horse go. The mare had carried her to safety, and she would miss her. But she could not afford to keep a horse in town, and she needed the money more than she needed the transportation now. She found a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Harriet Caldwell, a brisk woman in her 50s who asked only 2 questions. Could Willa pay her rent on time? And did she mind sharing a room with 2 other working girls? Willa answered yes and no respectively, and just like that she had a place to live. The room was small, with 3 narrow beds crammed in and little space for anything else. Her roommates were a pair of sisters who worked at one of the town's restaurants. They were friendly enough, and they helped Willa find work at a laundry that served the hotels and restaurants. The work was hard, hot, and endless. Willa spent her days up to her elbows in scalding water and harsh soap, scrubbing linens until her hands cracked and bled. But it was honest work and it paid enough to cover her rent and meals, and no one asked about her past or why a young woman was living alone without family. For 2 months, Willa lived quietly in Flagstaff. She worked at the laundry, she attended church on Sundays to maintain respectability, she saved every penny she could. She was careful not to draw attention to herself. The fear of being found never quite left her, but as the weeks passed with no sign of Preston's men, she began to believe she might actually have escaped for good. She thought about Yates Ormond more than she wanted to admit. She wondered what had happened when they discovered she was gone. Had Preston punished him? Had he lost his job? Had he been hurt because he helped her? The guilt of not knowing gnawed at her, but there was nothing she could do about it. She could not risk reaching out, could not risk leaving any trail that might lead back to her. December came and brought snow to Flagstaff. The pine forest turned white and beautiful, and the cold was bitter but clean. Nothing like the suffocating heat of the desert. Willa was walking home from the laundry one evening, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind, when she saw a figure leaning against a post outside her boarding house. Even bundled in a heavy coat with his hat pulled low, she knew him instantly. Yates Ormond. Willa stopped dead in the street, her heart suddenly racing. He straightened when he saw her, and even in the dim light of the street lamps she could see the smile on his face. "Hello, Miss Zimmerman," he said. "I was starting to think I had the wrong town." Willa could not speak. Her mind was spinning with 1,000 questions. How did he find her? Why was he here? Was he alone? But what came out of her mouth was, "Are you all right? Did Mr. Preston hurt you?" Yates's smile widened. "I am fine. Got fired, but that was no great loss. Preston is a miserable bastard to work for anyway." He glanced around at the street, at the people passing by. "Could we maybe talk somewhere warmer? I have been waiting here for 3 hours, and I think my toes are frozen solid." Willa nodded mutely. She could not take him to her room, not with her roommates there, and Mrs. Caldwell watching like a hawk for any impropriety. But there was a small cafe down the street that stayed open late. She led him there, and they sat at a corner table as far from the other customers as they could manage. A waitress brought coffee, and Yates wrapped his hands around the cup like a man who had not been warm in days. Willa studied him across the table. He looked thinner than she remembered, harder somehow, but his eyes were the same, kind and sharp at once. "How did you find me?" she asked finally. "It was not easy," Yates admitted. "I waited a few weeks after you left until things settled down at the compound. Then I quit and started asking questions. I heard about a girl matching your description who passed through a little settlement west of Coolidge, and the store owner there said she thought you might have headed north. After that, it was just a matter of checking towns between there and here until I found someone who had seen you." "You spent weeks looking for me," Willa said slowly. "Why?" Yates looked down at his coffee. "Because I needed to know you were all right. Because I have been thinking about you every day since you rode out of that compound. Because—" He stopped, then met her eyes directly. "Because I think I started falling for you the minute I saw you trying to sneak into that corral like the world's worst horse thief." Willa's breath caught. She had not expected honesty that direct, that raw. "You do not even know me." "I know you were brave enough to risk everything for your freedom," Yates said. "I know you were strong enough to survive a 200-mile ride through hostile country. I know you were smart enough to disappear and start over. That is more than most people reveal about themselves in a lifetime." "You gave up your job and spent weeks tracking me down," Willa said. "That is either the most romantic thing I have ever heard or the most foolish." "Can it not be both?" Yates asked, and there was a hint of humor in his voice that made Willa's chest ache. She realized she was smiling, really smiling for the first time in months. "What were you planning to do once you found me? Assuming I did not have you arrested for stalking." "Honestly, I had not thought that far ahead. I just knew I needed to see you again." He paused. "But now that I'm here, I'm hoping maybe you will let me stay. Let me court you properly if you are willing. I know it is fast, I know it is strange, but Willa, I cannot get you out of my head." "I have nothing," Willa said quietly. "No family, no money beyond what I make scrubbing other people's laundry. I am probably still legally promised to Ezekiel Preston, even if I will die before I go back there. Any association with me could be dangerous for you." "Preston will not come after you," Yates said. "He already replaced you. Married his 9th wife about 3 weeks after you left. Some poor girl from Florence whose parents were desperate for the money." His face darkened. "The man is a predator, but he is not the type to chase down a lost sheep when he has a whole flock still penned up." Willa absorbed that information. She should feel relieved, but instead she just felt sick for the girl who had taken her place. "And what about you? What do you have?" "Not much more than you," Yates admitted. "I have the money I saved from working for Preston, and I have a decent reputation as a ranch hand and wrangler. I was thinking about looking for work on one of the big cattle operations up north, maybe in Montana or Wyoming. But I would rather stay here if you will have me." Willa looked at him across the scarred wooden table. This man who had given her a horse and a head start and then given up everything to find her again. He was not handsome in a conventional way, but there was something about him that drew her in, something solid and true and good. She thought about how lonely she had been these past 2 months, how much she had thought about him, how her heart had leaped when she recognized him outside the boarding house. "I do not believe in love at first sight," she said carefully. "I do not believe in fairy tales or romantic rescues. The world has taught me to be more careful than that." "I am not asking you to believe in anything," Yates said. "I am just asking you to give me a chance to prove that some things are worth believing in." Willa felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back stubbornly. "If you stay, you need to find work. And we need to court properly, respectably. Mrs. Caldwell will throw me out if there's even a hint of scandal." "I can do respectable," Yates said. "I clean up pretty well when I try. And we need to take this slow. I am not ready to jump into anything serious. I need time to figure out who I am now without my father or Preston or anyone else making decisions for me." "Slow is fine," Yates said. "I am not going anywhere." They talked until the cafe closed, sharing their stories. Yates told her about growing up on a farm in Kansas with his 8 sisters, about coming west to make his fortune and finding only hard work and harder men. Willa told him about her childhood in Colorado, about her mother's death and her father's slow descent into drinking and debt, about the terrible day he told her she was sold to Preston to save the farm. When they finally walked back to the boarding house, the snow was falling softly and the streets were quiet. Yates stopped at the front steps and took off his hat. "Thank you for not having me arrested," he said. "The night is still young," Willa replied, but she was smiling. "Can I see you again? Tomorrow, maybe? I could meet you after work?" "I would like that," Willa said. Yates grinned, and it transformed his whole face. "Good. That is real good." He rode away into the snowy night, and Willa stood on the steps watching him go, her heart doing strange, fluttery things in her chest that she absolutely refused to acknowledge as anything serious. But when she went inside and got ready for bed, she could not stop smiling. Yates found work at one of the lumber mills within 2 days. It was brutal labor, but it paid better than ranch work, and he took to it with the same quiet competence he seemed to bring to everything. He rented a room at a boarding house on the other side of town and began the careful, respectful courtship he had promised Willa. He met her after work and walked her home. He took her to church on Sundays and to the occasional social event in town. He was always proper, always mindful of her reputation, but there was an intensity to the way he looked at her that made Willa's knees weak. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. Yates told her his dreams of owning his own ranch someday, a small place where he could raise horses and cattle and build a life on his own terms. Willa told him about wanting to learn to read better, to educate herself, to be more than just a pair of hands doing laundry or cooking or cleaning. "I could teach you," Yates said one evening as they sat on a bench outside the boarding house, carefully chaperoned by Mrs. Caldwell's watchful eye from the window. "I am not the best reader in the world, but my mother made sure all of us learned before she died." So they began reading lessons. Yates bought a newspaper every week, and they would go through it together, Willa stumbling over the words while Yates patiently helped her sound them out. When she got frustrated, he would tell her stories from the articles, making them funny or dramatic or both, until she was laughing too hard to be angry at her own limitations. Winter deepened and then began to loosen its grip. Spring came to Flagstaff with mud and wild flowers and longer days. Willa had been in the town for nearly 6 months now, and she no longer jumped at every shadow or scanned every crowd for Preston's men. She was building a life here, small and hard-won, but entirely her own. And Yates was in it, woven into every part of it. They were sitting by the creek one Sunday afternoon in April, watching the water rush by swollen with snowmelt, when Yates reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her beyond helping her over rough ground or offering his arm for propriety, and the contact sent a jolt through Willa's whole body. "I am in love with you," Yates said quietly. "I know we agreed to go slow. I know you are still figuring out who you are, but I cannot keep this to myself anymore. I love you, Willa Zimmerman. I love your courage and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to let the world break you. I love how hard you work and how much you have survived. I love the way you laugh when something really strikes you as funny, and the way you concentrate so hard when you're reading that you stick your tongue out a little bit. I just love you, and I needed you to know." Willa looked at their joined hands, at his work-roughened fingers intertwined with hers. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. She had known for weeks, maybe months, that she was falling for him too. But saying it out loud felt terrifying, like admitting it would somehow jinx the fragile happiness she had built. But Yates deserved the truth. He had given her so much already. "I love you too," she said, and her voice only shook a little. "I think I have loved you since that night in the compound when you saddled the mare for me. I was just too scared to admit it." Yates made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Can I court you with the intention of marriage? Real marriage. The kind where you get to choose and no one sells you like livestock? Yes, Willa said. Yes, you can. They were married 3 months later in the little church in Flagstaff, with Mrs. Caldwell and Willa's roommates as witnesses. Willa wore a simple blue dress that she bought with money saved from her laundry work, and Yates wore a new shirt and had his hair trimmed neat. They could not afford a big celebration, but the boarding house ladies threw them a small party with cake and lemonade, and Willa thought it was more beautiful than any fancy wedding could have been. Their first home was a tiny cabin on the outskirts of town. It had 2 rooms and a leaky roof and gaps in the walls that let in the wind, but it was theirs. Yates worked at the mill and took odd jobs on the weekends. Willa kept working at the laundry and took in sewing on the side. They saved every penny they could, working toward Yates's dream of their own ranch. The first year of marriage was hard in the way that building a life together is always hard. They learned each other's rhythms and habits and quirks. They fought about money and chores and whose turn it was to chop wood. But they also laughed together and read together and made love in their narrow bed with a tenderness that took Willa's breath away. I never knew it could be like this, she told Yates one night, curled against his chest in the darkness. I never knew marriage could be a partnership instead of a prison. It is supposed to be like this, Yates said, his hand stroking her hair. 2 people choosing each other every day, building something together. That is what love is. By the end of their first year together, Willa was pregnant. The discovery filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She was only 21, still so young, and the idea of bringing a child into the world felt enormous and overwhelming. But Yates was so happy when she told him that she could not help but be swept up in his excitement. "We are going to be parents," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a family." Their son was born in April of 1883, squalling and red-faced and perfect. They named him James, after Yates's father, who had died when Yates was young. Willa had never known love like what she felt for that baby, a fierce, protective devotion that made everything else in the world seem small by comparison. Yates was a natural father, patient and gentle with the baby, even when James cried for hours. He would walk the floor with his son tucked against his shoulder, singing old Kansas folk songs in his rough voice until the baby finally settled. Watching him, Willa fell in love with him all over again, deeper and truer than before. Money got tighter with the baby to feed and clothe. Willa had to stop working at the laundry, though she still took in sewing when she could manage it around caring for James. Yates picked up more odd jobs, working himself ragged to provide for his family. They were exhausted and broke, and the cabin felt even smaller with 3 people in it. But they were happy in a bone-deep way that no amount of money could buy. When James was 6 months old, Yates came home one evening with news. "I heard about a ranch down near Prescott that is looking for a foreman," he said. "The pay is better than the mill, and there is a house that comes with the job. It is not ownership, but it is a step in that direction." Willa looked around their drafty little cabin, then down at James asleep in her arms. "When do we leave?" They moved to Prescott in the fall of 1883. The ranch was called the Double Creek, 5,000 acres of grassland and timber that ran cattle and horses both. The owner was a man named Samuel Grant, older and gruff but fair, and he took to Yates immediately. The foreman's house was small but solid, with a real stove and glass windows and a bedroom separate from the main room. Yates thrived in the new position. He had a good eye for cattle and a way with horses that the other ranch hands respected. Within a year, he was practically running the operation, and Samuel Grant relied on him for all the major decisions. The pay was good enough that Willa could stay home with James, and they could start saving real money toward their own ranch. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm. Willa kept house and raised James, and occasionally helped with the ranch accounts when Samuel needed an extra pair of eyes. James grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn determination. The years passed, marked by seasons and cattle drives and the slow accumulation of savings. In 1885, Willa gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Clara. She had Willa's fair hair and Yates's kind eyes, and her brother immediately appointed himself her protector. Watching James hover over Clara's cradle, Willa thought about the family Yates had described, 8 sisters in Kansas, and she understood now how that childhood had shaped him into the man he was. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked him one night. "Your sisters?" "Every day," Yates admitted. "But I write to them when I can, and they write back. They know about you and the kids. My sister Martha says she wants to come visit someday, meet the woman who finally got me to settle down." "I would like that," Willa said, and she meant it. She wanted James and Clara to know their family, to understand where they came from. She thought less about her own father these days, the man who had sold her into misery. The wound was still there, but it had scarred over, less raw than it used to be. In 1887, Samuel Grant called Yates into his office and made an offer. He was getting old, he said, and his own children had no interest in ranching. He wanted to sell the Double Creek, and he wanted to sell it to Yates. They worked out an arrangement where Yates would pay him in installments over 10 years, with Samuel staying on to help with the transition. Willa cried when Yates told her. After all the years of saving and dreaming and working themselves to exhaustion, they were going to have their own ranch. Not a little place, but a real operation. 5,000 acres that they could build into something lasting. "We did it," Yates said, holding her while she wept into his shoulder. "We actually did it." They became ranch owners at ages 31 and 26 respectively, which was young but not unheard of in the territory. Yates threw himself into the work with renewed energy, improving the herd and expanding the horse breeding operation. Willa managed the household and the accounts, and discovered she had a head for business that surprised both of them. The ranch prospered. They hired more hands, built new barns and corrals, and bought the adjacent property when it came up for sale. James and Clara grew up on horseback, learning to ride and rope and work cattle alongside the ranch hands. Willa taught them both to read and write and cipher, determined that her children would have every advantage she had been denied. In 1889, Willa gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named William and Caroline. The house felt wonderfully chaotic with 4 children running through it, and Yates built an addition to give everyone more room. They hired a woman from town to help with the housework and the children, freeing Willa to take on more of the ranch business. Life was good, better than Willa had ever imagined possible during those dark days at Ezekiel Preston's compound. She thought about that sometimes, about the girl she had been who had risked everything for a chance at freedom. That girl had been brave but also terrified, desperate but also determined. Willa honored her by living the life she had fought for, by being happy and free and entirely her own person. One evening in the summer of 1890, Willa and Yates sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. The children were inside with Sarah, the hired help, probably causing some kind of chaos but nothing too terrible. The cattle were lowing in the distance, and somewhere a horse whinnied. It was the sound of home, of the life they had built together. "Do you remember that night I found you trying to steal a horse?" Yates asked. Willa laughed. "I was terrible at it. I would have woken the entire compound if you had not helped me." "I was so scared," Yates admitted. "I kept thinking about what Preston would do if he caught us, but then I looked at you and I just knew I had to help no matter what it cost." "It cost you your job," Willa pointed out. "Best decision I ever made," Yates said. He reached over and took her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "Every good thing in my life started that night. You, the kids, this ranch, all of it traces back to giving you that horse and a head start." "I never properly thanked you," Willa said, "for saving my life." "You thank me every day," Yates said, "by being here, by building this life with me, by loving me even when I am stubborn or stupid or both. That is thanks enough." Willa leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the sun sink below the horizon. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, from her father's failing farm to Preston's compound to that desperate midnight ride through the desert. She thought about finding her way to Flagstaff, about Yates finding his way to her, about all the choices and chances that had led to this moment. "I love you," she said. "I know I tell you all the time, but I want you to really hear it. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You gave me back my life, and then you made it beautiful." "I love you too," Yates said, "and I will keep loving you until the day I die, and probably after that too, if there is anything beyond." They sat together as the stars began to appear, holding hands like they had that day by the creek in Flagstaff when they first admitted how they felt. The children's laughter drifted out from the house, and the night insects began their chorus. Somewhere in the darkness, the ranch settled into sleep, 5,000 acres of dreams made real through hard work and determination and love. The years continued to unfold. James grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Clara was bright and curious, always reading and asking questions about everything. The twins were wild and energetic, constantly getting into trouble, but impossible not to love. In 1895, Willa and Yates celebrated their 14th wedding anniversary. They threw a party and invited everyone from the surrounding ranches in the town. The house was full of people and noise and laughter, and Willa moved through it all feeling like her heart might burst with joy. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left, Samuel Grant pulled Willa aside. He was in his 70s now, still sharp, but slowing down. "I want to tell you something," he said. "When Yates first came to work for me, I knew he was special, but I did not realize how special until I met you. You two have built something remarkable here, something that will last long after I'm gone. I am proud to have been part of it." "We could not have done it without you," Willa said, her eyes stinging with tears. "You gave us a chance when no one else would." "You earned everything you got," Samuel said firmly. "Do not ever forget that." Samuel died the following winter, peacefully in his sleep. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Yates made sure his headstone was the finest they could afford. It felt like the end of an era, but also like a passing of the torch. The Double Creek was entirely theirs now. No more payments, no more obligations. It was a bittersweet freedom. James turned 18 in 1901, a young man now rather than a boy. He had Yates's steady temperament and Willa's fierce determination, and he was already talking about expanding the horse breeding operation. Clara was 15, beautiful and smart, with half a dozen young men from neighboring ranches trying to court her. The twins were 12 and still inseparable, always up to some scheme or another. Willa looked at her children and marveled at how time had passed. It seemed like just yesterday she was fleeing through the desert with nothing but a borrowed horse and $40, and now she was the mother of 4 and the co-owner of a successful ranch. The girl she had been then felt like a different person, someone young and scared who could not have imagined this future. But she was grateful to that girl, grateful for her courage, her refusal to accept the life others had planned for her, her desperate bid for freedom. Without that midnight ride, none of this would exist. One evening in the spring of 1902, Willa was working on the accounts when Yates came in from the range. He was 46 now, his hair graying at the temples and his face more weathered than ever, but he was still strong and capable. He was still the man who had given her a horse and a head start, who had tracked her down out of love, who had built a life with her piece by patient piece. "Come outside," he said, holding out his hand. "There is something I want to show you." Willa let him lead her out to the porch. The sun was setting, painting everything golden, and in the corral by the barn was a new horse, a bay mare, young and strong, with intelligent eyes and good lines. "She reminded me of the horse I gave you that night," Yates said. "I thought maybe we could give her to Clara. She's ready for a horse of her own. And this one has the kind of heart that will take care of her." Willa felt tears spill down her cheeks. Even after all these years, Yates could still surprise her with his thoughtfulness, his way of connecting past and present, his understanding of what mattered. "She is perfect," Willa said. "So are you," Yates replied, pulling her into his arms. "So is this life we have made. I would not change a single moment of it, not even the hard parts. because they all led here to this, to us. They stood together watching the sunset, 46 and 41, married for 20 years, partners in every sense of the word. The ranch spread out around them, thousands of acres of land they had earned through sweat and sacrifice. Their children were inside, healthy and happy and free to make their own choices. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility. In 1905, James married a girl from a neighboring ranch, a sensible woman named Elizabeth who fit into the family as if she had always been there. They built a house on the western edge of the property, and James began to take over more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Yates was happy to step back a bit, to spend more time with Willa and the younger children. Clara had suitors lined up, but she was not in any hurry to marry. She wanted to travel first, she said, to see something beyond the territory. Willa and Yates gave her money for a train ticket to San Francisco, and she went with their blessing and a promise to write often. Her letters came regularly, full of descriptions of the ocean and the city and all the things she was learning. The twins were 17 now. William steady and reliable like his older brother, Carolyn wild and fearless. They were both excellent riders and had started competing in local rodeos, much to Willa's anxiety and Yates's pride. In 1907, James and Elizabeth had their first child, a boy they named Yates Samuel after his grandfather and the man who had given them their start. Holding his grandson for the first time, Yates cried openly, overwhelmed by the continuation of everything they had built. "This is what it was all for," he said to Willa later. "This is why we worked so hard, why we fought to make something lasting, so our children and grandchildren could have lives full of choices and possibilities. And love," Willa added, "so they could know what real love looks like, the kind that builds and sustains instead of trapping and diminishing." Yates kissed her forehead. "I am the luckiest man alive," he said, "to have found you, to have been given the chance to love you, to have built this life together. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "Even the part where you gave up your job and spent weeks tracking me down like a madman?" Willa asked, smiling. "Especially that part," Yates said. The years continued their steady march. Clara came home from San Francisco engaged to a man she met there, a lawyer who was smart and kind and treated her like an equal. They married and moved to Phoenix, where he had been offered a position with a growing firm. The twins turned 21 and William started courting a girl from town while Caroline announced she wanted to become a horse trainer, one of the few women in the territory doing that kind of work. Willa and Yates were in their 50s now, their children grown and starting families of their own. The ranch continued to prosper under James's management, and they had more grandchildren on the way. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm, less dramatic than the early years, but no less satisfying. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1913, their children threw them a celebration that brought together 3 generations of family and friends from across the territory. Willa wore a new dress that Caroline had bought for her in town, and Yates wore a suit that made him look distinguished despite his protests that he felt like a trussed-up turkey. James stood up to make a toast, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "To my parents," he said, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day, who showed us that with courage and determination you can build a life beyond anything you imagined, who gave us a home full of love and laughter and the freedom to become whoever we wanted to be. Thank you for everything you have done for us. We love you." Everyone raised their glasses, and Willa found she could not speak past the lump in her throat. Yates squeezed her hand, and when she looked at him, she saw tears on his cheeks too. After the party, they walked out to the porch where they'd spent so many evenings over the years. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the night air smelled of sage and pine. Willa leaned against the railing and looked out over the ranch, at the life they had built from nothing but hope and hard work. "Do you ever think about where we would be if that night had gone differently?" she asked. "If you had not helped me, or if I had been caught, or if you had not come to find me in Flagstaff?" "Sometimes," Yates admitted, "but not in a way that matters, because this is the life we have, and I cannot imagine wanting any other one." "I was so scared that night," Willa said. "I had no plan, no idea what I was doing. I just knew I had to run or die trying, and then you were there and you gave me a chance." "We gave each other a chance," Yates corrected. "You took the risk. You made the choice to save yourself. I just provided a horse and a head start. Everything else was you." "It was us," Willa said. "It has always been us. From that first night until now, we have done this together." Yates put his arm around her and pulled her close. They stood like that for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling the solid reality of the life they had made. 30 years of marriage, 4 children, a growing number of grandchildren, a ranch that would outlast them both. It was more than Willa had ever dreamed possible during those desperate weeks after her father sold her to Ezekiel Preston. "I am so glad you were terrible at stealing horses," Yates said suddenly, and Willa burst out laughing. "I am so glad you were working night watch that particular evening," she replied. "Some things are just meant to be," Yates said. "Maybe," Willa agreed. "Or maybe we just made them happen through sheer, stubborn determination." "That too," Yates said, smiling. They went back inside eventually, to their children and grandchildren and the warm light of home. But Willa carried that moment with her, the quiet acknowledgement of everything they had survived and built and become. She thought about the young woman who had fled into the desert and the cowboy who had helped her escape, and she sent them a silent thank you for being brave enough to take that first impossible step. The years grew kinder as Willa and Yates aged. They stepped back more and more from the daily operations of the ranch, leaving it in James's capable hands. They had time now for the things they had always been too busy for: long rides through the property, lazy afternoons reading together, visits with their growing family. Clara had 3 children in Phoenix and came home several times a year, bringing stories of city life that fascinated and bewildered her parents in equal measure. William married his sweetheart and built a house on the ranch, working alongside his brother. Caroline became one of the most respected horse trainers in the territory, and people came from hundreds of miles away to have her work with their difficult horses. In 1920, Willa and Yates celebrated their 37th anniversary. Yates was 64, and his joints ached in the mornings, but he still rode every day, and he still looked at Willa like she was the most amazing thing he had ever seen. Willa was 59, and her hair was more gray than gold now, but she was still sharp as a tack and still running the ranch accounts with an efficiency that impressed everyone. They had 8 grandchildren now, with more on the way. The oldest, young Yates, was 18 and already showing signs of being as good a rancher as his father and grandfather. The youngest was just 2, a little girl named Willa, after her grandmother, who was stubborn and fearless and absolutely adored. On a warm evening in May, Willa and Yates sat on their porch watching the sunset. It was their favorite time of day when the work was done and the ranch settled into peaceful evening rhythms. Yates had his arm around Willa's shoulders and she was leaning into him, comfortable and content. "Do you know what I'm most proud of?" Willa asked suddenly. "What is that, darling?" "That we built a family where everyone knows they are loved for exactly who they are, where no one gets sold or traded or forced into anything, where our children and grandchildren have the freedom to make their own choices and the support to pursue their own dreams. That is what love is supposed to do," Yates said. "It is supposed to liberate, not imprison. You taught me that, you know. That night when you chose freedom over safety, when you risked everything rather than accept a life that would destroy you. That took more courage than I have ever had." "You had courage too," Willa said. "You risked your job and maybe your life to help a stranger. And then you tracked me down across 200 miles of territory because you believed we could have something real together. That is pretty brave." "We have always been brave together," Yates said. "That is our secret. Separately we might have failed, but together we could do anything." Willa turned to look at him, really look at him. His face was lined now, weathered by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes were still the same, still kind and true. She loved him more now than she had at 21, loved him with the deep, abiding affection that came from building a life together through good times and hard times, through raising children and burying friends, through every small daily choice to keep choosing each other. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me a horse and a head start all those years ago, for giving me a chance at this life." "Thank you for taking it," Yates replied, "for being brave enough to run, and brave enough to let me catch up with you, and brave enough to build this with me." They kissed as the sun finally slipped below the horizon, two people who had found each other in the darkness and made a light bright enough to last a lifetime. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, the cattle settling in for the night, the horses moving in their corrals, the distant sound of their grandchildren playing before bedtime. It was everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of during those early, desperate days when they were just starting out. It was home and family and love, built on a foundation of courage and choice, and the simple belief that people deserve to make their own destinies. As the stars began to appear overhead, Willa thought about the girl she had been at 20, terrified but determined, fleeing into the unknown with nothing but borrowed hope. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that it would all work out, that the cowboy who gave her a horse would become her husband and partner and the love of her life, that they would build something beautiful together, something that would last long after they were gone. But maybe that girl already knew somewhere deep down. Maybe the moment Yates stepped out of the shadows and offered to help, she recognized something essential in him, some fundamental goodness that she could trust. Maybe that was why she let him find her in Flagstaff, why she gave him a chance to prove himself, why she eventually opened her heart to love after trauma had taught her to guard it so carefully. "What are you thinking about, Weedkin?" Yates asked, sensing her abstraction. "How lucky we are," Willa said. "How many things had to go exactly right for us to end up here? If I had run a different direction, if you had not been on watch that night, if you had not come looking for me, if I had not given you a chance, so many moments where everything could have gone wrong." "But they did not," Yates said firmly. "We made our own luck, darling. We made good choices, and we worked hard, and we loved each other through everything. That is not luck. That is us." Willa smiled and kissed him again, soft and sweet. "You are right. That is us." They sat together as the night deepened, holding hands and watching the stars. Two people who had defied the odds and built a love story that would echo through generations. Their children would tell the story to their grandchildren, about the girl who ran from a polygamous marriage at night and the cowboy who gave her a horse and a head start, about how that single act of kindness and courage had rippled outward to create a family and a ranch and a legacy of freedom and love. It was a good story. It was a true story. And most importantly, it was their story, lived and earned and cherished every day of their long and happy life together. As the years continued to unfold, as their family grew and the ranch prospered, Willa and Yates carried that story with them always, a reminder of where they had come from and what they had overcome to build their forever.